Thank you for tuning in to Gods, Demons, and Magic. This is your host, Sri Sachinandan Das. So today we're going to continue discussing about the daemon, and in particular one's personal daemon. There's actually two ways in which one finds their personal daemon, according to these various Hellenistic philosophers. One is through astrology, and one is through theurgy. So, and we see here in this letter to Nebo by Porphyry, as part of the broader text, the Egyptian Mysteries by Iamblichus, Porphyry is very much an astrologer, and he's actually asking Nebo, the Egyptian priest. First of all, he asks him about the cosmology of the universe. He asks him essentially, what is the absolute truth? What is the true position of that which is beyond matter, the spiritual, of God or the divine light? And then he asks him about the structure of the universe itself, and it's very much seen in astrological terms, about the various spheres of the planets, and essentially how does astrology, or how do the various gods of the universe and the daemons which are submitted to them, or via mediums to them, how do they structure and organize reality? And then he asks Nebo, can you please explain how through astrology one can find one's personal daemon, that particular sub-god, or you might say guardian angel, which has been assigned to one to guide one throughout life, to organize one's life, to bring one into the body at the moment which is astrologically appropriate, and to, in a sense, give enthusiasm and inspiration to you to raise your consciousness and to strive spiritually on the path of virtue, in harmony with nature and the organization of nature by the gods. And so Porphyry's asking about this. How can we find our daemon? Now, Iamblichus, he has a little bit of a different opinion. He's not so much into astrology. Porphyry is an astrologer. He's very much into the technicalities of divination. Whereas Iamblichus, he's much more of a magician. He's into the process of theurgy, or the conjuring of spirits, or even the devotional worship of spirits through, or gods through ritual practice. And so, and for that reason, Iamblichus is very strongly attracted to and associated with the Egyptian priesthood. Now, there's a very interesting story about the teacher of Porphyry, Plotinus. He was residing in Rome, and there was one Egyptian priest who was visiting Rome. He became known to Plotinus, and he actually offered Plotinus that he could show him who his personal daemon was, not through astrology, but by directly invoking him. They would perform a ritual, much like a magic ritual, and this daemon would come forth and speak to them and talk to them. And so Plotinus agreed, and he actually met this Egyptian priest at the temple of Isis in Rome, and the priest had said this is the purest place he could find in Rome. And so they met there, and we can imagine that Plotinus arrived there with many of his followers and disciples, and there were many people in attendance to watch this magical feat from this priest. Now, when the priest performed this ritual in order to summon his daemon, what appeared was not a regular daemon, but an actual god. And so everyone was shocked, and especially the Egyptian priest was actually very shocked and was congratulating Plotinus. He said, "Happy Plotinus, who has a god for a daemon," in a sense that there's your daemons generally are spirits. They're generally sort of in between the realm of the gods and human beings. But if you're certain people who are very fortunate, and especially, it seems to me, individuals who are on a spiritual path, or on a path that is more directly related to self-realization, you'll have very high-level daemons come down to assist them. And for individuals who are very, very special, people like Plotinus, people who are great saints and sages, you may even have one of the gods, or one of the planetary deities, may actually come and perform the duty of being one's daemon. Now, it's very interesting that at this ritual, normally they would ask the daemon questions and try to get answers and things like that, find out very clearly the identity, and the individual who the daemon is assisting could perhaps even speak to the daemon directly. In this case, it didn't happen. There was actually someone who was at the ritual who was very fearful. Obviously it's not every day that you go to a magic ritual and see a god being invoked and appear before everyone. And so he had brought some birds with him, and I'm not exactly sure what the birds were for. There may have been some sort of sacrifice or totem or some sort of charm to protect him. But this individual was there, and he was holding these birds in his hand, and he became so terrified and anxious in the situation that he actually choked the bird or suffocated the bird, and the bird died right there in the midst of the ritual. And so the Egyptian priest, somehow or other, the ritual was broken prematurely due to this death which had happened, defiling the environment. So again, you see in this story, you also see the importance of ritual purity. When one's practicing theurgy, or one is in essence interacting with the gods or communicating with the gods through ritual, then the situation of ritual must be very pure. It must be conducted according to very strict guidelines, and especially when you're dealing with something like a god. If you're dealing with something like the ghosts of the dead or demonic beings or something like that, evil entities, then the environment, the purity of the environment is sometimes irrelevant, or may even be the opposite, where you have to defile the environment in order to make that spirit feel comfortable. But with the gods, they won't interact until the environment is pristine and pure, and the consciousness of those participating is pure. So if there's some sort of death, even the death of a bird, in the midst of such a ritual, then immediately the line of communication is broken. It's kind of like creating static in the line, as you're trying to speak to this god or communicate to this god. And it's also interesting that Plotinus, he is very fortunate. He was very fortunate to have this god as his daemon. And we see that he himself, as mentioned in the first episode, was a miracle worker. He was very much known for having an elevated state of consciousness and having an elevated sense of intuition. You might say his psychic abilities were fine-tuned. And so there's many stories associated with Iamblichus as a miracle worker, and this we can guess or assume this comes because of his close association with this daemon, this powerful daemon or god, which was assisting him. And if you remember, the daemon, one of the roles of the daemons is to encourage you in the elevation of your consciousness. And if you listen to the encouragement of the daemon, you take cues from the daemon, then from the daemon he will give you wisdom, he'll give you knowledge, and also give you intuition. As was mentioned before, one of the particular qualities of the astrologer is the astrologer has fine-tuned his or her power of intuition by, in a sense, listening to the voice of their daemon and purifying their consciousness and following the path of virtue as advised by the daemon. And so Plotinus was an individual, you might say, who was very strongly listening to and taking the uplifting association of his daemon as it guided him in life, and therefore his intuitive powers were quite strong. It's one of his particular abilities is he was able to pick out a thief. For example, someone had stolen from him, and without any evidence he accused the individual of the theft, and only later, after a very long time, did the individual admit and say, actually, yes, I was the one who stole. Oftentimes he would make predictions without even using an astrological chart. Someone could just come up to him and, like you would approach an astrologer and expect them to do a reading for you. He didn't even need to do a reading. He would just tell you immediately and answer all the questions that you may have in an accurate way. There's another story associated with Plotinus where one of his disciples, and again, these are spiritualists, like these are individuals who were trying to raise their consciousness above the fetters of the flesh, above the intense, sometimes overwhelming, confusing desires of the material body. And therefore, one of his followers was actually struggling very heavily in his spiritual life and very frustrated in a sense with being bound within matter as a soul. And you'll see this sometimes, this attitude rise in people and spiritual path who are either depressed or disturbed mentally or frustrated, that they contemplate suicide. They think, if I kill myself, then I'll get out of this entanglement, this tabernacle of the body, and somehow I'll overcome all of these spiritual challenges by just destroying myself. So this particular mentality, of course, it's an aberration. It's not appropriate in spiritual life. And Plotinus, without this individual even telling Plotinus of this idea, he was thinking, I'm going to go commit suicide somewhere, and he was actually walking down the road, and Plotinus appeared before him and sort of blocked his path. And he immediately told him, I know that you want to commit suicide, and I forbid you to do so. And he actually ordered him away from Rome. He told him to leave Rome and to sort of work on his depression, work on his internal struggles. And he did, and he eventually got better. So you see that the Plotinus, this is due to his being, having refined his consciousness. He was very much in touch with the intuitive side of himself. And you may say this is sort of the highest level of astrologer, an individual that doesn't even need a chart. Just somebody just comes up to him, and immediately he's able to read exactly what's going on. Another thing which cultivates this internal capacity for intuition is the practice of yoga. Not hatha yoga, the physical exercises, but the actual system of yoga, the system of meditation. If one is able to meditate and control the mind and fix the mind very powerfully, and especially to have some realization of transcendence, then as a byproduct, naturally one's intuitive abilities and powers are not only awakened, but they become very strong. This, in other words, the process of spiritual elevation, or the raising of consciousness, the byproduct is naturally that you become very intuitive and you understand things very clearly. And so this can be a tool, you might say, or this can be very helpful for an astrologer. And we can see at a very high level, the mystic doesn't even consult an astrological chart. Just from within, he understands the truth. And a very high exhibition of this is in the various mystical traditions and devotional traditions. Those individuals that are surrendering completely and wholly to God, then the idea is that God from within enlightens them and destroys the darkness within them. And it's almost like beams of light shooting out from their eyes, like the way they're enlightened from within and the light is filling them, and then as they look out upon the world, they see the world and sort of this bright light that's shining from within them. And in this way, they're able to understand things very clearly due to that inner light. In addition, the idea is there that God, in essence, will enlighten the individual and give the individual knowledge that's needed for the individual's spiritual advancement. So there's a kind of, even for individuals on the mystical path, then there's a way in which God within will actually give information to the individual which is needed for their particular service or their spiritual practice or their assistance of others. So there's a sense in which the mystics, as they become advanced in consciousness, become well springs of a sort of transcendental light and transcendental knowledge. And with that knowledge, they're able to see things clearly within the world. And that ability transcends sort of the lower process of using divination. And in fact, divination itself is merely the sort of reflection of this natural divine quality of mystical consciousness. It's really just sort of a lower level wherein you're using tools to try to access that intuition within yourself, which isn't fully grown yet. But through the mystical processes, just like you might find a spark, and then you fan the spark, and gradually it grows and grows and grows and grows. So similarly, as the spiritual light within you is kindled and starts to blaze and grow and grow and grow, then that light itself shines out. Whereas you might say the astrologer, or the person who is more in a mundane consciousness in general, is taking that little tiny light within himself, not yet fully kindled, and kind of holding it up to an astrological chart and using his intelligence to try to see by that light and try to give an accurate prediction by that small light. But when the light is actually blazing, it doesn't even need a chart. You can just look directly at the individual, and then all of the knowledge is there. And so both Iamblichus and Porphyry are after this same elevation in consciousness, but they take two different roads to it. As mentioned in the previous episode, Porphyry, he elevates astrology to the level of a religion. He wants to use the astrological chart, in essence, to see the harmonious divine arrangement of the universe by the gods, and to live in harmony with that, to align oneself with that, and also to cultivate knowledge in the association of one's daemon and to follow the path of virtue. And so it's very much a path of sort of understanding the nature of the material world and how it works, and using it in a way that one makes spiritual advancement. Whereas Iamblichus, he's kind of like a wild man, he just goes directly for the jugular. He's not going to deal with the material. He's not interested in the spheres of planets. He's not interested in fate, and he's not even really interested in daemons. He says you just got to get down and perform rituals. You have to perform rituals that interact with the gods directly, and you have to purify your consciousness through that sort of ritual magic. You kind of have to throw yourself right into a relationship with these deities and worship them, essentially. And you can even invoke them. Why learn about your daemon by looking through your astrological chart and trying to figure it out? You can just invoke your daemon with magic and have him standing right before you. As we saw with the story of the individual, sort of crushing or suffocating that bird, that's a tense situation. That's a scary situation. To actually invoke a daemon, or even try to invoke a god, or to interact with a god. I mean, you're really throwing yourself in there. You're putting yourself right into the mix of it, putting your soul on the line, in a sense. And so, but that's how Iamblichus prefers it. Why go through this process of astrological speculation and sort of trying to evolve spiritually by using the material, when you can just throw yourself into a spiritual practice, sort of a cult practice, and develop yourself spiritually that way, in a very powerful way. Now, Iamblichus wasn't totally against astrology, but he felt that it was submissive to the principles of cult ritual worship. And so he would use astrology in order to time rituals. And this is how many of the ancient traditional cultures have done it, is that whenever a significant ritual is being performed, you have to find the astrologically appropriate time so that ritual is in harmony with the universe. An important ritual is the installation of the deity, or the installation of the form of the god in the temple. You'll see in ancient Egypt, in this very, very elaborate rituals, and it's like a huge festival filled with rituals and all sorts of different things in order to call down the deity and ask that particular god to enter into that form, that statue that's within the temple. And so these would have to be done at astrological times, that times that are chosen very carefully for their astrological significance, oftentimes and related to that particular god. For example, say you're having a deity of the sun god or something like that, then you would find an astrological moment which brings forth the power of the sun god, and then utilize that moment to perform the ritual. And you'll see, so in one sense, like a very smaller version of that is the empowerment of astrological talismans. As we discussed before, you have a very ancient tradition all throughout the world where different talismans are made, sort of invoking the powers of deities or the powers of planets, and using astrological timing to do that, to sort of focus the energy of that planet and have it rain down into this particular object, almost like to bring the potency, those cosmic energies, and infuse a particular object with those energies, and using the timing of the planets to do that. And so the installations of deities and the performance of various rituals and sacrifices were all done with that same level of intensity. And so Iamblichus uses astrology for that purpose, but again, it's submissive to the principle of cult worship. And while Iamblichus finds uses for astrology and doesn't necessarily denigrate astrology, he considers it material. It's very mundane. It's dealing with one's material conditioning, one's material existence in this world, one's bondage to the laws of fate or karma. And, the planets themselves, they're ultimately material. Whereas theurgic cult ritual worship that he was engaged in, it totally transcends the material. It goes beyond the planets and the planetary spheres. It transcends one's personal karma or bondage into this world of fate, because when you use that cult worship to worship the one transcendent God, who's beyond matter, that beneficent deity that was mentioned before, then that whole platform, in essence, of God is beyond fate. It's beyond the law of karma. It's above the planets. It's essentially beyond this machinery of bondage that is the world. And so if you use that cult worship to contact that transcendent God, then you move totally beyond the realm of fate. And so for that reason, he finds it's that process to be superior to astrology. It's kind of like if you have two people in a prison, and one person is interested in being a good prisoner, and he understands, he first of all, he sort of elevates his consciousness by slowly recognizing the nature of the prison itself, looking up, seeing the bars. He finally notices the window. He notices the walkway and the balcony outside of his cell. And then, over time he gets to know the guards, kind of like the daemon. There's a certain guard that comes every day, checks on him, gives him his food, says, "How are you doing? What are you doing?" And he becomes friends with that guard. And then by becoming friends with the guard, it's like an entranceway to civilian life. Like that individual is actually going to, ultimately that relationship is going to help him become a better person. It's going to sort of socialize him with the outside world. And by speaking to the guard and befriending the guard, he may eventually get to come out of the cell and do different jobs. Maybe he can mop the floor of the balcony. Maybe he can mop the big floor downstairs, the cell block. Or, maybe he can start working in the kitchen or something like that. And by doing this gradually, and working with the authorities of the prison, who are sort of like the gods themselves, or the warden, then he, over a long period of time, and proving his sincerity, then he's able to leave. He's able to be paroled. Whereas and that's sort of like using astrology to understand the prison house of material existence, to befriend one's daemon and to please the gods, and eventually attain higher levels of consciousness until you're qualified to leave the prison. Whereas Iamblichus, what he does is sort of like use rituals to blow a hole in the wall of the prison and just sort of like jump directly outside. He's just going to, you can imagine the president is driving by the prison, in his motorcade, and you're just going to reach through the bars and shout out the president's name and try to get the president's attention. And so divine rituals, in essence, are like shouting out that name. And so when the president hears that, then, he stops his car. Maybe he's on a tour with the warden, and he asks, "Who is that prisoner?" And then immediately he, from above the prison house, he actually commands the warden that you set him free. And so it is, a more direct and more powerful, in a sense, way of leaving the prison house. So please join us next time. We'll discuss more about one's personal daemon and how to find it astrologically. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandana.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again. We hope that you'll join us next time on Gods, Demons, and Magic.